When Margaret Sullivan chose love over blood, she never imagined her own kin would leave her to face the wolves alone. The autumn of 1944 painted Millbrook Valley in shades of rust and gold, but Margaret Sullivan saw only gray. Gray like the prison uniform of the man who'd stolen her heart. Gray like the storm clouds gathering over her family's wheat farm. Gray like the future that stretched ahead, empty as a winter field. She pressed her palm against the kitchen window, watching her father's truck disappear down the dirt road, carrying the last of her belongings. 23 years she'd called this place home. 23 years of Sunday dinners and harvest festivals, of her mother's lullabies and her father's gentle corrections. All of it erased in a single moment when she'd spoken 3 words that shattered everything. I married him. The memory still burned. Her father's face had drained of color like water from a broken dam. Her mother had gripped the back of a chair so hard her knuckles went white. Her brother Thomas had simply walked out, slamming the door with such force that her grandmother's china rattled in the cabinet. "You married a Nazi," her father had whispered, the word dripping with disgust. "He's not," Margaret had started, but the words died in her throat. How could she explain that Klaus was different? That behind the barbed wire and guard towers, she'd found a man who spoke softly of his mother's garden, who carved tiny wooden birds from scraps, who'd never fired a shot in anger. Now she stood alone in the 2-room cabin on the edge of town that Mrs. Fleming had reluctantly agreed to rent to her. The old woman's kindness came with conditions: no visitors after dark, rent paid in advance, and if there's trouble, don't come crying to me. Margaret understood. In a town where 3 boys had died at Normandy and 2 more were still missing in the Pacific, loving the enemy was unforgivable. Even if that enemy had surrendered without a fight. Even if he'd been nothing more than a farm boy from Bavaria who'd been drafted at 17 and dreamed only of going home. The sound of boots on gravel made her heart skip. Through the window, she saw Klaus approaching, still wearing the faded denims and wool shirt that marked him as a prisoner of war. His blonde hair had grown longer since their secret wedding ceremony 3 weeks ago, performed by Pastor Kellerman. In the basement of the Lutheran church at dawn, the old minister had agreed only because Klaus had wept as he spoke of his faith, had recited scripture in broken English, had promised to love and protect Margaret until his dying breath. Klaus paused at the door, as he always did, waiting for her invitation. The habit broke her heart every time. This man who'd learned that safety came from asking permission, from making himself small and unthreatening. "Come in," she called, opening the door wide. "You're home." The word still felt strange on her tongue. Home. Not the sprawling farmhouse where 4 generations of Sullivans had been born and buried, but this cramped cabin with its leaky roof and temperamental stove. Home because Klaus was here. He entered carefully, removing his work boots and setting them precisely by the door. 3 months of marriage. If their courthouse ceremony and stolen moments could be called that, and he still moved like a man, expecting punishment. "How was the work detail?" she asked, noting the fresh scrape on his knuckles, the way he favored his left shoulder. "The bridge repairs go well," he said, his accent softening the consonants. "The foreman, he says perhaps 2 more weeks. 2 more weeks, and then what? The war was winding down, everyone said so. The German prisoners would be sent home or transferred to other camps. Klaus's fate hung in the balance like autumn leaves. Before a storm, Margaret touched his injured hand. "What happened?" "Nothing." A board slipped. His dark eyes met hers, and she saw the truth he wouldn't speak. Someone had made their feelings known about Klaus's presence in town. Someone always did. She led him to the small table where she'd set out their meager dinner: potatoes from her own garden, green beans she'd canned herself, and a precious piece of ham from the Kowalskis, the only family in town who still spoke. To her, Mrs. Kowalski understood what it meant to love someone the world called enemy. Her own husband had fled Poland in 1939, carrying nothing but hope and heartbreak. "I received a letter today," Klaus said quietly, pulling an envelope from his shirt pocket. The paper was thin, worn from handling. "From my sister." Margaret's breath caught. Klaus rarely spoke of his family, as if mentioning them might somehow endanger them across the ocean. She knew he had a younger sister named Greta and parents who farmed near Munich. She knew his father had opposed the war and his mother had hidden Jewish neighbors in their cellar. She knew Klaus carried their photographs in a small tin box, handling them like sacred relics. She writes that the Americans have been kind. Klaus continued, unfolding the letter with trembling fingers. The farm is damaged, but not destroyed. She hopes I will come home soon. The unspoken question hung between them like smoke. Will you come with me? Margaret had been asking herself the same question every night as she lay beside this man who'd become her whole world. Could she leave everything she'd ever known? Could she start over in a country that had been her enemy? Could she learn a new language, new customs, new ways of being? More importantly, would Klaus's family accept her any more readily than hers had accepted him? The camp commander wants to see me tomorrow, Klaus said, refolding the letter. There is talk of processing, of sending some of us to other places. Margaret's fork clattered against her plate. She'd known this moment would come, had dreaded it like a cancer growing in her chest. The war was ending, and with it, Klaus's reason for being here. Soon he would be just another displaced person in a world trying to rebuild itself. What kind of processing? She managed. Klaus shrugged, but she caught the flash of fear in his eyes. Perhaps repatriation. Perhaps transfer to work camps in other states. Perhaps. He didn't finish, but they both knew. Perhaps something worse. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending leaves skittering across the porch. Somewhere in the distance, a dog howled, a lonesome sound that seemed to echo the ache in Margaret's chest. She reached across the table and took Klaus's hand, feeling the calluses from his work detail, the thin gold band she'd placed there with. Shaking fingers 3 weeks ago. Whatever happens, she whispered, we face it together. But even as she spoke the words, she wondered if love would be enough to carry them through what was coming. If the world would ever forgive them for choosing each other across enemy lines. The dog's howling grew closer, and with it, the sound of truck engines rumbling through the night. The truck engines grew louder, accompanied by the crunch of gravel and the slam of doors. Margaret's blood turned to ice water as voices drifted through the thin cabin walls. Harsh, familiar voices that belonged to men she'd known since childhood. You sure this is the place, Tommy? Margaret's heart lurched. Thomas. Her own brother's voice, thick with something she'd never heard before. Hatred mixed with whiskey and grief. Klaus was on his feet instantly, moving with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to danger. He positioned himself between Margaret and the door, his body tense as a bowstring. Go to the bedroom, he whispered. Lock the door. No. Margaret stood beside him, her chin lifted in defiance that masked her terror. This is our home. We face this together. The pounding on the door came like gunshots. Open up, Maggie. We know you're in there. Through the window, Margaret could see the silhouettes of at least 4 men. Her brother Thomas stood at the front, swaying slightly, a bottle glinting in his hand. Behind him, she recognized Jake Morrison, whose son had died at Anzio, and Pete Kowalski, not the kind Mrs. Kowalski who brought them ham, but her bitter son who'd returned from Guadalcanal with shrapnel in his leg and rage in his heart. Margaret Sullivan, you open this door right now. Thomas's voice cracked like a whip. We need to talk. Klaus's hand found hers, squeezing gently. I will go with them, he said quietly. It is me they want. Over my dead body. The words came out fiercer than she'd intended, and she saw something flicker in Klaus's eyes, surprise, pride, and a deep sadness that made her chest ache. Maggie, don't make this harder than it has to be. Thomas called again. Send the Nazi out, and we'll leave you be. Margaret moved to the window, pushing aside the thin curtain. In the glow of truck headlights, her brother looked older than his 25 years. The war had aged them all, but Thomas bore scars that went deeper than skin. He'd been at Pearl Harbor when the bombs fell, had watched friends die in the oily water of the harbor. The brother who'd once braided her hair and taught her to whistle had returned a stranger wrapped in familiar skin. Go home, Tommy, she called through the glass. There's nothing for you here. Nothing. His laugh was bitter as burnt coffee. My sister's whoring herself to the enemy, and you call that nothing? The words hit like a physical blow. Margaret heard Klaus's sharp intake of breath, felt his muscles coil with barely restrained fury. Careful, she murmured, her hand on his arm. He wants you to lose your temper. Klaus nodded slowly, understanding. Violence would only prove what they already believed, that he was the enemy, dangerous, and unpredictable. We're not leaving until you come out and talk sense. Jake. Morrison's voice joined the chorus. That Nazi's got you bewitched, girl, but we're going to cure you of that sickness. Margaret's fear crystallized into something sharper, protective rage. These men, who'd known her since she was knee-high to a grasshopper, who'd attended her confirmation and graduation, now spoke of her like she was a diseased animal to be put down. I'm going out there, she decided. No. Klaus caught her arm. It is not safe. It's not safe for you either, but they're my people. My responsibility. She saw the argument forming on his lips and forestalled it with a kiss. Quick, fierce, tasting. Of desperation and determination. Trust me, she whispered. Before he could protest further, she unlatched the door and stepped onto the porch. The autumn air cut through her thin dress like a blade, but she stood straight-backed and steady, facing down the men in her yard. Thomas lurched forward, and she caught the full force of his pain. Red-rimmed eyes, stubbled cheeks, the tremor in his hands that spoke of too many nights spent drowning his memories in corn whiskey. Jesus, Maggie, he breathed. Look at you. Look what he's done to you. She looked down at herself, trying to see what he saw. The same brown hair, now longer than fashion dictated. The same green eyes, perhaps brighter with purpose. The same freckled hands, now wearing a simple gold band that caught the moonlight. I look like a woman in love, she said quietly. Thomas flinched as if she'd struck him. Love? That's what you call this. This abomination. I call it marriage. Legal and blessed by God, whatever you might think. God. Pete Kowalski spat into the dirt. God don't bless unions with the devil, girl. That Nazi killed my brother's boy, killed Jake's son, killed every American boy who died fighting his kind. Klaus never killed anyone, Margaret said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her knees. He was a conscript, a farm boy who don't. Thomas's roar silenced the night insects. Don't you dare make excuses for him. They're all the same, every last one of them. Murderers and animals, and you. His voice broke. You were supposed to be different. You were supposed to be pure. The word hung in the air like a curse. Pure, as if loving someone made her dirty, contaminated, less than human. I am exactly who I've always been, she said. The only thing that's changed is that I found someone who sees me truly and loves me anyway. Love. Jake Morrison stepped forward, his weathered face twisted with disgust. That ain't love, girl. That's brainwashing. That Nazi got inside your head, made you forget who you are, where you come from. I know exactly where I come from. I come from a family that taught me to judge people by their actions, not their uniforms. I come from parents who raised me to believe in redemption and second chances. Her voice grew stronger with each word. I come from a faith that says love conquers hate. Pretty words, Pete sneered. But love don't bring back the dead. Love don't heal the wounds them Nazi bastards carved into this world. Margaret felt Klaus's presence behind her, though he remained inside. She could sense his struggle, every instinct telling him to defend her, his training as a prisoner teaching him to stay hidden. You want to talk about wounds? She said, stepping down from the porch to face them on level ground. Let's talk about yours, Pete. You came back from the Pacific with hate eating you alive. You drink yourself senseless every night because you can't forget what you saw. You push away everyone who tries to help because it's easier to rage than to heal. Pete's face flushed red. You don't know nothing about what I've been through. I know you're letting it destroy you. Just like you're letting it destroy any chance at happiness you might have left. She turned to her brother, her heart breaking, at the hollow look in his eyes. And you, Tommy, my sweet brother who used to catch fireflies with me in mason jars. The war took pieces of you I can never get back, but you're letting it take the rest. You're choosing hate over healing, vengeance over peace. Peace. Thomas laughed bitterly. There ain't no peace for men like us, Maggie. There's only the fight. And you went and picked the wrong side. I didn't pick a side. I picked a person. A good person who's been through hell just like you have. Good. Jake's voice cracked like a whip. A good Nazi? That's like saying good poison or good cancer. It don't exist. Margaret felt her patience wearing thin, her protective instincts sharpening to a point. Klaus Brenner is not a Nazi. He never joined the party. He was conscripted at 17, forced to fight in a war he didn't believe in, for causes he didn't support. He surrendered at the first opportunity because he refused to kill. He spent 3 years in prison camps, working honest labor and praying for peace. Pretty story, Pete said. Got any proof? I have his letters. His testimony. The word of the guards who've worked with him. The word of a Nazi. Thomas spat. The circular logic made her want to scream. No matter what she said, they would twist it to fit their narrative. Klaus was guilty because he was German. German because he was the enemy. The enemy because he was Nazi. Round and round, like water down a drain, carrying away any possibility of understanding. You know what? She said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. You're right about one thing. I have changed. I used to believe that people could overcome their prejudices if you just showed them enough love, enough patience, enough truth. But standing here, looking at you, men I've known and loved my whole life, I realize some wounds go too deep to heal. She climbed back onto the porch, her hand on the door handle. Klaus is twice the man any of you are. He's kind where you're cruel, gentle where you're violent, hopeful where you're bitter. He's everything you used to be before the war poisoned your hearts. Maggie. Thomas started forward, but she held up her hand. No, I'm done. I chose love, and you chose hate. I chose healing, and you chose vengeance. I chose to build something new, and you chose to cling to old wounds like they were treasures. Her voice grew steady, implacable. You want to disown me? Fine. But I will not apologize for loving a good man, and I will not let you destroy what we've built. She stepped back inside and threw the bolt, her heart hammering against her ribs. Klaus stood waiting in the shadows, his face etched with concern and something else. Admiration, perhaps, or gratitude. Outside, the men argued among themselves, their voices growing more heated. She heard Thomas defending her, Pete cursing, Jake demanding action. The sound of engines starting up, doors slamming, but they didn't leave. The trucks idled in the yard, and she knew this was far from over. Through the thin walls came the ominous sound of glass breaking. The sound wasn't glass breaking. It was ice forming on the windows as the temperature plummeted. But the mistake revealed how tightly Margaret's nerves were wound, how every small sound now carried the potential for violence. Klaus moved to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains. They are still there, he murmured. Talking, planning. Margaret joined him, pressing her face to the cold glass. In the truck headlights, she could see her brother pacing like a caged animal, his hands gesturing wildly as he spoke to the other men. Jake Morrison sat on his tailgate, taking long pulls from a bottle. Pete Kowalski leaned against his truck, cleaning his fingernails with a pocket knife, a gesture that might have been casual if not for the way his eyes never left their cabin. What are they waiting for? Margaret whispered. For me to come out, or for them to find courage in that bottle. Klaus's accent thickened with fatigue and strain. In the camps, men like this. They circle like wolves until one becomes bold enough to attack. Margaret's stomach clenched. You've seen this before? Klaus nodded grimly. In the early days, before the Geneva Convention protections were enforced, some guards, some prisoners, from other countries, they believed we deserved punishment beyond imprisonment. She thought of the fresh scrapes on his knuckles, the way he sometimes winced when he thought she wasn't looking. How many times had he endured what was happening now? How many times had he stood silent while hatred rained down on him like hail? I won't let them hurt you, she said fiercely. Klaus turned from the window, his dark eyes soft with something that might have been pity. Liebchen, you cannot stop this. Perhaps it would be better if I surrender to them. Let them have their moment of justice. Justice? The word came out sharp as broken glass. There's nothing just about a mob in the night. But there is something just about protecting the woman I love. The simple declaration stole her breath. In 3 months of marriage, they'd spoken of affection, of caring, of the strange magnetic pull that had drawn them together across enemy lines. But love, that word had remained unspoken, too dangerous, too large for the fragile thing they were building. Klaus, I have known since the first day you brought books to the camp, he continued, his voice steady despite the chaos outside. When you read to me from your Whitman, your face lit up like sunrise. I thought, this woman, she sees beauty where others see only darkness. And I knew I was lost. Margaret remembered that day 6 months ago. She'd volunteered with the Red Cross, bringing reading materials to the prisoners. Most of the women delivered the books and left quickly, but something about Klaus had made her linger. Perhaps it was the gentleness in his hands as he turned the pages, or the way he closed his eyes when she read poetry aloud, as if storing the words in some secret place. "You quoted Goethe back to me," she whispered. "In German, then in English. Doubt can only be removed by action. And you said, then we must act." Klaus cupped her face in his calloused hands. "You were so brave, agreeing to meet me at the church social, knowing what people would say. That had been the beginning. Stolen conversations at community gatherings, letters passed through sympathetic guards, meetings in the safety of Pastor Kellerman's study. Each encounter had been a small act of rebellion against a world determined to keep them apart. Outside, the men's voices grew louder, more agitated. Margaret heard her name spoken like a curse, Klaus's like a death sentence. "They're working themselves up," she observed. "Tommy's trying to talk them down. But grief makes men do terrible things," Klaus finished. "I have seen it. In my own country, before the war. Good people, driven by loss and fear, becoming monsters." A new sound cut through the night, the rumble of another engine, this one lighter, more refined. Through the window, Margaret saw headlights approaching from the opposite direction, and her heart leaped with desperate hope. The black sedan pulled to a stop behind the trucks, and Sheriff Dalton stepped out, his badge glinting in the light. He was a tall, lean man in his 50s, with silver hair and the kind of steady presence that could calm a spooked horse or a rioting crowd. "Evening, boys," his voice carried clearly in the cold air. "Y'all having some kind of meeting I should know about?" Thomas straightened, swaying slightly. "Just talking to my sister, Sheriff. Family business." "That's so." Dalton's tone remained conversational, but Margaret caught the steel underneath. "Funny thing about family business. Usually happens inside, not out in the yard with trucks and bottles." "The Nazis got her brainwashed." Pete spoke up, his words slurring. "Won't listen to reason." "Ah." Sheriff Dalton nodded slowly. "And you boys figured you'd help her see reason by showing up here at 10:30 at night, drunk and armed." "We ain't armed," Jake protested. Dalton's flashlight beams swept over the men, lingering on the hunting rifle visible in Jake's truck bed, the pistol holstered at Pete's hip. "My mistake," the sheriff said dryly. "Must be seeing things in this light." Margaret felt Klaus tense beside her as Dalton approached their door. The sheriff had always been fair but firm, a man who upheld the law without favoritism. But the law was a complicated thing when it came to enemy prisoners and the American women who loved them. "Mrs. Brenner?" Dalton called softly. "You folks all right in there?" Mrs. Brenner. He'd used her married name, the name that was legal, if not socially accepted. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes about where he stood in this conflict. Margaret opened the door, keeping Klaus behind her. "We're fine, Sheriff. Just trying to have a quiet evening." Dalton touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am, I got a complaint about disturbing the peace. Seems there's been some raised voices in the neighborhood." "Not from us," Margaret said firmly. "Didn't figure it was." His eyes flicked to Klaus, who stepped into view with careful, non-threatening movements. "Mr. Brenner, you boys having any trouble tonight?" Klaus's English became more formal under stress, each word precisely chosen. "No trouble, sir. We are grateful for your attention to this matter." "Well now," Dalton turned back to the men in the yard. "Seems like the folks being complained about are handling things just fine. Y'all, on the other hand, are creating what we might call a public disturbance." Thomas lurched forward. "Sheriff, that Nazi's poisoned my sister's mind. She ain't thinking straight." "That's so." Dalton's voice remained level. "And you figure the best way to help her think straight is to show up drunk with guns, making threats." "We didn't threaten nobody," Pete protested. "Well, let's see." Dalton pulled a small notebook from his shirt pocket. "I got reports of loud voices, intimidation, and what one neighbor described as men with violent intentions. Now, I could write all this up as a disturbance complaint, maybe add some charges about public intoxication and brandishing weapons." The men shifted uncomfortably. In a small town, arrest records became permanent stains on reputation and employability. "Or," Dalton continued, "y'all could get in your trucks and head home, sleep off whatever's driving this foolishness, and we'll pretend this never happened." Thomas opened his mouth to argue, but Jake grabbed his arm. "Come on, Tommy. This ain't The time or place. There ain't gonna be a right time or place, Thomas said bitterly, but he allowed himself to be led toward the trucks. Not for this abomination. As the men climbed into their vehicles, Dalton approached the porch. His weathered face showed the strain of a man trying to keep peace in a world determined to tear itself apart. I can't be everywhere, he said quietly, and I can't change people's hearts. But I can enforce the law, and the law says you folks have a right to live in peace. Thank you, Margaret said, meaning it. Don't thank me yet. Dalton's expression was grave. This ain't over. Your brother's hurting bad, Mrs. Brenner. Hurting people do unpredictable things. And there's talk in town, ugly talk about taking matters into private hands. Klaus stepped forward. What kind of talk? The kind that ends with someone getting hurt or worse. Dalton met Klaus's eyes directly. You served your time, paid your debt. Far as I'm concerned, you're a free man with the right to build a life. But not everyone sees it that way. The trucks were pulling away, their taillights disappearing into the darkness. But Margaret felt no relief. If anything, the sheriff's warning had made the danger feel more real, more immediate. There's something else, Dalton said, lowering his voice. I got word from the camp commander. There's going to be a processing review next week. Decisions about repatriation, permanent settlement, that sort of thing. Margaret's blood turned to ice. What kind of decisions? That's up to the federal authorities. But Dalton hesitated, then seemed to reach a decision. There's political pressure to send the POWs home as quickly as possible. Public opinion's running against keeping enemy soldiers on American soil, even the cooperative ones. Klaus's hand found Margaret's, squeezing gently. How long, he asked. Could be days. Could be weeks. Hard to say. Dalton looked between them, his expression softening slightly. You folks might want to think about making some plans. Just in case. As the sheriff drove away, Margaret stood in the doorway watching his taillights fade into the distance. The night felt different now. Heavier, more charged with possibility and threat. Behind her, Klaus moved through their small home, checking the windows, testing the locks. Practical preparations for an uncertain future. Klaus, she said without turning around. Yes, when they process you next week. She finally faced him, seeing her own fear reflected in his dark eyes. What will you tell them? His smile was sad and beautiful and completely heartbreaking. That depends, he said softly, on whether you have made your choice. Margaret's choice came not in the quiet contemplation she'd imagined, but in the harsh glare of flames that painted their cabin walls orange and gold. She woke to the acrid smell of smoke and Klaus shaking her shoulder, his face grim in the pre-dawn darkness. Margaret, wake up. We must go. Now. Through the bedroom window, she could see their small barn engulfed in fire, the flames reaching toward the sky like desperate prayers. The structure Klaus had spent weeks repairing, where he'd planned to keep the chickens they'd talked about buying, where he'd carved her initials into the wooden beam above the door, all of it disappearing into ash and memory. Oh God, she breathed, stumbling from bed. How did it? It was set, Klaus said grimly, pulling on his boots. I saw them running from the building. 3 men, maybe 4. Margaret's heart clenched. Tommy, I could not see faces in the darkness. But Klaus met her eyes, and she saw the truth there. Her brother's final act of desperate love, destroying what he couldn't save, burning what he couldn't bear to lose to the enemy. They dressed quickly, grabbing the few possessions that mattered, Klaus's letters from home, Margaret's mother's Bible, the small wooden bird he'd carved for her on their wedding day. Everything else, the quilts her grandmother had made, the photographs of happier times, the modest furniture they'd bought with hope and saved pennies, would have to be abandoned as they stepped onto the porch. Margaret saw that the fire had been carefully contained. The barn burned fiercely, but the flames hadn't spread to the cabin or the surrounding trees. This wasn't random destruction, it was a message. Next time, it will be the house. Next time, it will be you. In the distance, she could hear the fire bell ringing from town, the volunteer brigade rousing themselves to battle a blaze that would be nothing but embers by the time they arrived. Too little, too late, the story of her entire life in Millbrook Valley. We cannot stay here, Klaus said, his voice steady despite the chaos. Not anymore. Margaret nodded, understanding flooding through her like cold water. The processing review wasn't days away, It was this morning. Klaus's appointment with the camp commander was in 3 hours, and whatever decision they made had to be made now, in the smoke and shadows of their burning dreams. The truck, she said, pointing to Klaus's borrowed work vehicle parked behind the cabin. Can you drive it? Yes, but where? Everywhere. The word came out fierce, determined. Anywhere but here. They loaded their meager belongings into the back of the truck, working in silence broken only by the roar and crackle of flames. Margaret took one last look at the cabin that had been their first real home, the place where they'd learned to be married, where they'd planned their future, where they'd believed love might be enough to overcome the world's hatred. Klaus started the engine, the sound unnaturally loud in the pre-dawn stillness. As they pulled away from the cabin, Margaret saw a figure standing at the edge of the tree line, too far away to identify, but close enough to send a chill down her spine. Watching, waiting, making sure they understood the message. The road stretched ahead of them, empty and dark, leading away from everything Margaret had ever known. She should have felt terrified, she realized. Should have been sobbing for the life she was leaving behind. Instead, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months: freedom. Where are we going? Klaus asked as they reached the main highway. Margaret pulled out the letter she'd been carrying in her coat pocket for 2 weeks, the response to her own desperate inquiry, written on official letterhead that had made her hands shake when she'd first seen it. Chicago, she said. There's a resettlement office there. They help people like us. Klaus glanced at the letter, his eyes widening as he read. You have been planning this since the night you told me about your sister's letter. Since I realized they would never let us build a life here. Margaret folded the letter carefully, her heart hammering. There's a job waiting at a factory that makes farm equipment. They need men who understand machinery, who can work with their hands. And there's housing for married couples. Married couples where one is German. Married couples where both are willing to work hard and keep their heads down. Margaret's voice grew stronger. It's not perfect, Klaus. It's not the fairy tale ending we dreamed of. But it's a chance. They drove in silence for several miles, the burning barn fading to an orange glow in the rearview mirror. The sun was beginning to rise, painting the horizon in shades of pink and gold that reminded Margaret of better mornings, when she'd watched the dawn from her childhood bedroom window and believed the world was full of infinite possibilities. There is something I must tell you, Klaus said finally. About the processing review. Margaret's stomach clenched. What? The camp commander. He has offered me a choice. Immediate repatriation to Germany or transfer to a work camp in Texas for 2 more years before possible citizenship consideration. And you didn't tell me. The words came out sharper than she'd intended. Klaus's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Because there is a third option he did not mention. One I have been considering since the night your brother came to our door. What kind of option? Klaus pulled the truck to the side of the road, the engine idling as he turned to face her fully. In the growing light, she could see the exhaustion in his face, the weight of decisions that could shape the rest of their lives. Desertion, he said quietly. I could simply disappear, become someone else. There are men who have done this, changed their names, found new places to live. The war is ending. The camps are chaotic. It would not be difficult. Margaret stared at him, understanding flooding through her like ice water. You'd become a fugitive. For the rest of your life. For our life, Klaus corrected. Together, free from camps and processing reviews and the constant threat of separation. The enormity of what he was suggesting hit her like a physical blow. Klaus would be giving up any hope of legal status, of citizenship, of ever seeing his family again. He would be trading his identity for their love, burning every bridge behind him just as surely as her brother had burned their barn. Klaus, you can't. I can. His voice was steady, implacable. I have thought of nothing else for weeks. What is my life in Germany now? My parents are old. My sister has her own family. I have no home there anymore. Only memories of war and loss. But here, he cupped her face in his hands. Here I have you. Here I have hope. A car approached from behind them, slowing as it passed. Margaret recognized Mrs. Henderson from the post office, her face pressed to the window, eyes wide with curiosity and suspicion. The gossip would be all over town by noon. Margaret Sullivan and her Nazi husband, spotted on the highway, before dawn with their belongings in the back of a truck. We need to keep moving, Margaret said. People are going to start looking for us. Klaus nodded, pulling back onto the road. But the weight of his revelation hung between them like smoke. He was willing to give up everything, his past, his identity, his very name, for their love. The question was whether she was willing to accept such a sacrifice. The miles passed in tense silence, broken only by the rumble of the engine and the whisper of wind through the partially open windows. They were heading north now, toward the interstate that would take them to Chicago and whatever future they could build there. But Margaret's mind kept returning to Klaus's words. Desertion, disappearance, a life built on false names and buried truths that as they crested a hill. Margaret saw something that made her blood freeze, a roadblock ahead, 2 police cars positioned across the highway with their lights flashing. Officers stood beside the vehicles, checking papers, searching cars. They're looking for us, she whispered. Klaus saw the roadblock and immediately began slowing the truck. What do you want to do? Margaret's mind raced through their options. They could turn around, try to find back roads, but that would only delay the inevitable. They could try to bluff their way through, but Klaus's accent and obvious foreign appearance would raise immediate suspicions. Or, stop the truck, she said suddenly. Margaret, stop the truck, Klaus. Right here. He pulled to the shoulder. About a quarter mile from the roadblock, his face tense with confusion. What are you thinking? Margaret turned to face him, her heart breaking and mending itself in the same moment. I'm thinking that I love you too much to let you destroy yourself. For me, I don't understand. The roadblock, the processing review, all of it, it's bigger than us, Klaus. We can't outrun the government, can't hide from who we are forever. She took his hands in hers, feeling the calluses from honest work, the thin gold band that marked him as hers. But we can face it together. Legally. Honestly. Klaus's eyes widened with understanding. You want to go back. I want to go forward. But the right way. Margaret's voice grew stronger with conviction. You're not a deserter, Klaus. You're not a criminal or a fugitive. You're a good man who served his time and earned his freedom. Don't throw that away for me. But the processing review, we'll face it together. Whatever they decide, we'll find a way to make it work. Margaret squeezed his hands. And if they send you back to Germany, you would come with me? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and terror. Margaret thought of her family, her language, her entire life rooted in American soil. Then she thought of Klaus, gentle, faithful Klaus who'd already given up everything for love. I would come with you, she said simply. Wherever you go, that's home. Klaus's eyes filled with tears, the first she'd ever seen him shed. Liebchen, no. More running, Margaret said firmly. No more hiding. We face the world as we are, 2 people who love each other enough to build something beautiful from the ashes of war. Klaus nodded slowly, his jaw set with new determination. He put the truck in gear and began driving toward the roadblock, toward whatever future awaited them there. As they approached the police cars, Margaret saw Sheriff Dalton step out from behind one of the vehicles. His face was grim but not unkind, and she realized this wasn't a manhunt, it was a rescue. Mrs. Brenner, he called as they stopped. Mr. Brenner, y'all all right? We heard about the fire. Just fine, Sheriff, Margaret called back, her voice steady as stone. We're going home. Home, as it turned out, was a processed cheese factory in Milwaukee, where Klaus's steady hands and mechanical aptitude earned him respect among men who cared more about work ethic than war history. Home was a 2-room apartment above Kowalski's bakery, run by distant cousins of Mrs. Kowalski from Millbrook Valley, who believed in second chances and fresh starts. Home was Margaret's job at the telephone company, connecting voices across distances that had once seemed impossible to bridge. But none of that came easily, and none of it came quickly. The processing review that autumn morning in 1944 had been a crucible that tested everything Margaret thought she knew about justice, mercy, and the power of love to change hearts. Sheriff Dalton had escorted them back to the camp, where Klaus faced a tribunal of military officials and immigration authorities who held his future in their manila folders and rubber stamps. Margaret had been allowed to wait in the hallway, listening to the murmur of voices through thin walls, catching fragments that made her heart race. Words like repatriation, national security, and public sentiment drifted through the door like smoke from a distant fire. When Klaus finally emerged, His face was carefully neutral, the expression of a man who'd learned to hide hope as a survival mechanism. "Well?" Margaret asked, though part of her feared the answer. "6 months," Klaus said quietly. 6 months of additional supervised residence, then permanent resident status if there are no incidents. Margaret felt her knees nearly buckle with relief. "They're letting you stay." "They are letting us stay," Klaus corrected, pulling out a second set of papers. "Contingent on marriage verification, character references, and relocation to an area where there is less community resistance." The marriage verification had been easy. Pastor Kellerman's records were meticulous, and their union was legal, under both state and federal law. The character references had been more challenging until an unexpected source emerged: Dr. Patricia Aldrich, the Red Cross volunteer coordinator who'd supervised Margaret's work at the camp. Dr. Aldrich was a formidable woman in her 60s who'd spent the war years advocating for prisoners' rights and humane treatment. Her letter to the tribunal was a masterpiece of quiet authority, describing Klaus as a model of rehabilitation and peaceful integration, and Margaret as a young woman of exceptional character whose compassion represents the highest ideals of American values. But it was the final requirement, relocation, that had proven most difficult. Town after town had rejected their application for residency. Factory after factory had refused to hire a former enemy prisoner. Landlord after landlord had found excuses to deny them housing. Until Milwaukee. Until the Kowalski cousins, Anna and Stefan, who'd fled Poland before the war and understood what it meant to start over in a place that didn't always welcome strangers. Until the processed cheese factory, where the foreman was a practical man who cared more about Klaus's ability to repair machinery than his accent. Until the telephone company, where Margaret's clear voice and patient demeanor made her a natural for connecting long-distance calls. The 6 months of supervised residence had passed like a held breath. Weekly check-ins with federal authorities. Monthly reports on employment and housing. Constant awareness that one complaint, one incident, one moment of public controversy could shatter everything they'd built. But slowly, carefully, they'd woven themselves into the fabric of their new community. Klaus joined the volunteer fire department, his experience with machinery making him invaluable when equipment needed repair. Margaret organized a reading circle at the local library, her love of literature creating connections with women who might otherwise have remained suspicious of the German immigrant's wife. They learned to navigate the subtle hierarchies of their new world, which neighbors could be trusted with casual conversation, which shopkeepers would serve them without hostility, which churches welcomed all worshippers regardless of accent or origin. They learned to be grateful for small kindnesses and patient with small cruelties. And now, 2 years later, Margaret stood in their tiny kitchen garden, watching Klaus plant tomato seedlings in soil they'd enriched with coffee grounds from Anna Kowalski's bakery and vegetable scraps they'd composted through the long Wisconsin winter. "The soil is good here," Klaus observed, his hands gentle as he firmed the earth around each plant. "Different from home, but good." Margaret knew he meant both gardens. The one in Bavaria where he'd learned to coax life from stubborn ground, and this small plot behind their apartment building where he was teaching her the patience required for growing things. Both places had shaped him, and both deserved the title home. "Anna says we should try beans along the fence," Margaret said, settling beside him in the dirt. "She has seeds from Poland, her grandmother's variety." Klaus smiled at this. In their small community of transplants and refugees, seeds were currency more valuable than money. Each packet carried not just the promise of future harvest, but the weight of memory, the hope of continuity, the stubborn belief that beautiful things could grow in foreign soil. "Your brother sent another letter," Margaret said quietly. Klaus's hands stilled on the plants. Thomas had been writing for 6 months now, short, awkward letters that struggled to bridge the chasm his anger had carved between them. The first had been a single sentence: "I was wrong about burning the barn." The second had included a photograph of their parents' farm, with a note that their father was thinking of selling. The most recent had contained something that might have been an apology, buried beneath layers of masculine pride and carefully neutral prose. "What does he say this time?" Klaus asked. Margaret pulled the letter from her pocket, unfolding it carefully. "He says Papa died last month. Peaceful, in his sleep. And that he's been thinking about what I said that night. About choosing hate over healing. Klaus sat back on his heels, processing this news. Margaret's father had never spoken to her again after the night she'd announced her marriage. His death meant the permanent closing of a door that had never quite opened. "I'm sorry," Klaus said simply. "I know you hoped." "I hoped for many things," Margaret replied. "But hoping doesn't change what people choose to do with their hearts." They worked in comfortable silence for a while, their hands dark with good earth, the spring sun warming their shoulders. Around them, the city hummed with post-war energy, factories expanding, neighborhoods growing, people building new lives from the rubble of old ones. "Klaus," Margaret said eventually, "do you ever regret it? Giving up the chance to go home to your family?" Klaus considered this, his dark eyes reflecting the afternoon light. "I think about my sister sometimes. Wonder if she has children now, if the farm has recovered. But regret." He shook his head. "How can I regret the choice that brought me you? That gave us this." He gestured to their small garden, their simple apartment, the life they'd built one careful day at a time. It wasn't the grand romance Margaret had dreamed of as a girl. There were no castle towers or knight steeds, no dramatic rescues or passionate declarations. Instead, there was this: quiet mornings over coffee, shared work that felt like prayer, the slow accumulation of ordinary moments that somehow added up to extraordinary love. "I have a confession," Margaret said, pulling a small envelope from her other pocket. "I wrote to your sister months ago, through the Red Cross International Service." Klaus's eyes widened. "Margaret," she wrote back. Margaret handed him the envelope, her heart racing. "I can't read it, obviously, but there are photographs. And I think she wants to meet the woman who stole her brother's heart." Klaus opened the envelope with trembling fingers, pulling out a letter written in careful German script and 3 small photographs. Margaret watched his face transform as he read, surprise giving way to joy, joy giving way to something that might have been hope. "She says," his voice caught. "She says the American girl who writes such kind letters must be the answer to their prayers. That any woman who could love her brother enough to leave everything behind must be family already." Klaus looked up, tears bright in his eyes. "She wants us to come for a visit, when we can manage the trip." Margaret felt something break open in her chest. Not pain, but its opposite. The possibility of belonging somewhere larger than their small apartment, their carefully constructed life. The chance to be part of Klaus's story instead of just the woman who'd taken him away from it. "A visit," she repeated. "To Germany. To meet the family you've never had a chance to know," Klaus said. "To see the places that made me who I am." Margaret looked around their small garden, at the tomato plants they'd nurtured from seeds, at the beans they would train along the fence. With Anna's Polish varieties, growing things required patience, faith, and the willingness to tend something fragile until it became strong enough to survive on its own. "Yes," she said simply. "When we can manage the trip, we'll go home. To all our homes." Klaus pulled her close, kissing her forehead with the reverence of a man who'd learned never to take love for granted. Around them, spring continued its ancient work of transformation, turning soil into sustenance, seeds into promise, 2 war-torn hearts into something that could weather any storm. In the distance, church bells chimed the hour, and Margaret thought of all the Sunday mornings she'd spent in pews that no longer welcomed her. Now she and Klaus had found a small Lutheran church where Pastor Mueller preached in accented English about redemption and second chances, where former enemies sat beside former allies, where love was measured not in grand gestures, but in the quiet decision to choose mercy over judgment. Day after ordinary day, the war had torn the world apart, but here in this small patch of earth, 2 hearts had learned to plant new seeds in foreign soil, and discovered that love, like all growing things, blooms most beautifully where it's been transplanted with hope. Well now, that's quite a tale of love conquering all, isn't it? Hearts tested by fire, choosing hope over hate, building something beautiful from the ashes of war. If this story touched your soul like morning dew on fresh flowers, kindly show your appreciation with a thumbs up and share your thoughts in the comments below. Now then, let us know in the comments, where in this wide world are you watching from today?